AI has not replaced people. It's freed people from mundane tasks. And I think over the next 10 years, we're going to see a Cambrian explosion of new innovations, new opportunities for people to contribute. I think beyond 10 years, nobody knows what they're talking about. And if I was to give you the kind of two extremes that we hear in the press, the one extreme is that if we can free up whole jobs, we probably will. And if that happens very quickly, we create lots of unemployment, our economies can't rebalance, and it creates social unrest. And I actually think that we need to lean into figuring out how to solve that problem. The alternative view is we should be automating as much and as fast as possible by removing the friction from the creation and dissemination of goods like food, healthcare, energy, education, transport. We can bring the cost of goods down to zero. So it's often referred to as a world of abundance or a Star Trek economy. But if you were born into a world where you don't have access to paid work, but have access to everything that you need to survive and thrive as a human being, I actually think that's an amazing world.
Welcome back to the Outside Context. We're so excited to be back and for today's amazing episode on AI. But before we get to that, Jannah, what was your outside context moment of the week?
Elise, so today I'm a little bit croaky, just to warn everyone. I've had some sort of horrific flu that's been going around that completely laid me out for a couple of days, during which I did contemplate life, the universe, and everything in some depth. And I also discovered a new science fiction author, and that's Ned Bowman, whose most recent book, Venomous Lumpsucker, I read over Christmas. And since then, I've been eagerly devouring everything else he's written. Now, one thing about Ned Bowman, when I started reading him, and I'm beginning to think as well that Venomous Lumpsucker may be his most accessible novel, there was something oddly familiar in a way that I really enjoy about his books. He's very prone to digressions, and sometimes the digression becomes, and the sort of background setup to the world that he's writing about becomes as important as, the key plot points and the key characters and things like that. And I realized the other day who this reminded me of. I don't know if you've ever read Tom Robbins, Even Cowgirls Get the Blues.
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
Yes. If you like Tom Robbins, for our listeners out there, then you'll probably enjoy Ned Bowman as well. It's a bit of that kind of winding, circuitous journey where the pleasure of the book is really almost in the side stories as much and the digressions as the main story itself. But back to Venomous Lumpsucker and my outside contact moment for this episode. Again, this is about the world building of Venomous Lumpsucker. So it seems a near future. I'm not going to give away too many plot spoilers. In which the giant panda has gone extinct, and over 1 billion people in China are, in emotional distress over the fact that their national treasure has become extinct. And this and China's growing economic and political ascendancy on the global stage means that they're in an incredibly influential position and are able to take some steps towards I wouldn't say preventing, because there's a general acceptance that species are going to become extinct, but managing extinction and recognizing the cost of extinction. So, to that effect, a jurisdictional organization, UN type thing, introduces the concept of extinction credits. You're going to, firms are going to do things that make species go extinct anyway. They're going to exploit resources, etc., is the premise. But the cost of this should be factored into their activities. So there's a certain number of extinction credits that are out there in circulation. If a species is made extinct, then a certain number of extinction credits have to be paid. And depending on the rate of extinctions happening, obviously the cost of extinction, the price of extinction credits on the global market varies. And there are different costs associated for different levels of life form that become extinct. So things that are very mundane or basic, don't play that important a role in the ecosystem, will cost a lower number of extinction credits, whereas species that, for example, exhibit signs of intelligence or consciousness will have a higher cost associated with them. Of course, this becomes a wildly lucrative market in extinction credits, and that's a key plot point of the book. And what this made me think about was, in the world in which we exist, our day-to-day policy careers, Elise, you and I, we're looking at topics in digital finance such as tokenization, and there's an increasing move to monetize, assign monetary value, and ascribe market forces to the exchange of everything and to all activity. And reading this book made me, realize more concretely something that I have felt for a long time, that we don't necessarily want to monetize everything, that things should have value, activities should have value, preserving things should have value in and of themselves and for reasons other than a monetary incentive. And so I think particularly as we continue to drive our industry forwards and digitization, we also need to be really mindful of what it is, what the real economic and what the real social outcomes are that we're enabling as well, I think.
I love a few things about this. First, which is that in explaining that the author themselves often went down kind of tangents and had backstories, you also had to provide a backstory for the outside context moment that you mentioned. So I really like that, first of all. But second, I completely agree with this, and the kind of, oftentimes when we think about like the Web3 future and like the tokenization of everything, I completely agree with you that I don't actually think that there should be necessarily a monetization of everything or like bringing every single thing into the financial services ecosystem. And there's a lot of things I could add on to that, but probably for a different podcast. But I'll mention one thing that's current at the moment is that IOSCO has an open consultation on finfluencers, like financial influencers. And a lot of the stuff that they're picking up when you read through it, in my opinion, I'm like, this isn't actually limited to financial services. Like, you can't isolate this because the like sphere of influence and celebrity and impersonation actually is so much broader. And to try to bring it into financial services might not actually be the best way forward in terms of thinking about how we preserve, civilization, how we, go forward and think about like human interaction. But I'll stop there because I feel like you and I could really talk about this for ages, and we do actually have a very interesting episode with Daniel. My outside context moment, though, was actually related to quite a personal one for me, which was that last week I sat down to take my Life in the UK test, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, this is the test that you have to take if you want to have indefinite leave to remain in the UK, which means you can stay in the UK forever and it doesn't have to be tied to your work, or if you want to have UK citizenship, both things which I am aiming to achieve. So last week I went and sat the Life of the UK test, and I failed it, which was depressing and honestly quite frustrating. This week, today in fact, just about a couple of hours ago, I sat the Life in the UK test again and passed it, which I'm really excited about because it means I can go ahead with trying to become a UK citizen, etc. But it did really provoke in me a really deep spiral about thinking about how you kind of prove who is worthy to live in a certain jurisdiction and be a citizen. And for those of you who haven't had the absolute joy of taking this test, it's a 24-question test about all different areas of the UK, from the UK's history to law to religion to culture and sport. And you have 45 minutes to answer 24 questions that could be on quite literally any of those topics. I can confirm that when I failed, I'm pretty sure that the ones I failed on were related to religion, as well as some very niche questions about British sporting famous people that I did not know who they were. But I think the broader point is this really the best way to prove someone's Britishness? And I was thinking about, since our episode is on AI, I wonder in the future if there will actually be ways for you to kind of build up almost a social credit history, dare I say, instead of having to sit down to quite an arbitrary test, to be honest, and answer relatively arbitrary questions, but instead that takes into account your work profile, how you actually contribute to your community, which is, by the way, one of the sections that you have to study, how you engage, for example, with, others around the country, places that you've been and visited, like maybe if you've seen a lot of the national parks, surely that would actually provide more value or donated to the National Trust rather than just memorizing a lot of these random places. And so I guess my wonder about the future is, in a future where we have, AI agents, digital ID, could there be a way to prove your Britishness that it sort of slowly accumulates over time and then you've actually built up enough credits to kind of prove that you're ready now then to become a citizen? Or will we always have this test model? I wonder about that. That was my outside context moment for the week.
I feel like there's a kernel of a good idea in there. I also think that it would be ripe for exploitation and could totally see it going down, the road of a Black Mirror episode. I also want to add as well that Venomous Lumpsucker has in it a slow burn Brexit joke that is worth reading the book. It's worth reading the book just for that, really. So yeah, please read the book.
Well, fantastic. I'll leave you at that and I won't complain about the test anymore. But one more thing before we go to our episode. Our brilliant producer, Helen, also read a really good book about AI recently called Hum by Helen Phillips. She's just let me borrow it, so I will report back. But this one is about AI agents taking jobs and the challenges that that can present and what to do when faced with sort of loss of job from AI. It's a fiction. She recommends it very highly. So thought I'd drop that one in for the listeners as well. But now let's go speak to Daniel.
So, Daniel, it's great to have you here with us today, and we're really looking forward to this. It's our first episode on AI, so we really want to start from first principles and take us and our listeners through the history of AI and where we are today and where it's going in the future. But let's start with you. So please tell us a bit about you, your journey, where what you've done in the past, what's got you to where you are today, and what you're doing right now.
Thank you. It's great to spend some time with you. I've been involved in AI for about 25 years. My undergraduate was in AI at UCL 25 years ago. My master's in AI, my PhD postdocs are all in AI from UCL. I ran a master's program in applied AI for some time where I had hundreds of students going out there applying these technologies. I'm currently entrepreneur in residence at UCL, so I help them spin out deep tech companies. It keeps me honest. I started a company about 17 years ago that's been building AI solutions for some of the biggest companies in the world, Tesco, PwC, DFS. I sold that to WPP, the biggest marketing company in the world, 3 years ago, where I continue to be the CEO of Satalia, my original company. Think of Satalia as being WPP's deep mind. We're about 350 deep AI experts applying AI to marketing, but also beyond marketing. I'm also the chief AI officer for WPP, so now coordinating AI across about 115,000 people, which is great fun. And I've just started a research organization to really lean into the questions of how do we build and should we build safe machine consciousness.
Wow, fantastic. And actually, I didn't know that, but I went to UCL for my master's as well, though very different topic. I was working in security studies and counterterrorism, so not at all an AI expert. But as Jannah said, we really want to kick off by taking this back to first principles. So given that you've been in this space for such a long time, what do we really mean when we talk about AI?
It's a great question. I think the most popular definition of AI, I actually think is the weakest definition, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. And the reason why it's popular is because ChatGPT and large language models are now able to do things that traditionally only human beings could do: recognize objects and images, correspond in natural language. But it's a weak definition because humans can find patterns in about 4 dimensions. We can solve problems up to 7. Computers can find patterns in thousands of dimensions. They can solve problems with lots of moving parts. And if I built a machine that could operate like a mouse or a dolphin, that would be the most intelligent machine we've ever created. So benchmarking machines against humans is a very silly thing to do. I did my master's on intelligence, and I'm a big fan of a definition from the 80s, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. It's essentially building systems that are able to make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt themselves so next time they can make better decisions. And actually, people like Einstein, Darwin, whilst they're not scholars of intelligence, this concept of adaptation, this concept of being able to change, is I think synonymous with intelligence. Now, if I held what we do in industry to that definition, building systems that can safely adapt themselves in production, one might controversially argue that nobody's doing AI, because actually most systems in production don't adapt themselves. They're static. And so over the past several years, I've been sort of arguing that looking at AI through definitions or even through technologies is not a very sensible thing to do. So over the years, I've developed a framework to think about AI through applications. What algorithms have emerged over the past 70 years, and how can those algorithms be applied to solving problems in ways that are as good or better than human beings? So AI has been cyclic over the past 70 years. Originally, it was technologies that were related to how our brains worked, perceptrons, neurons. That didn't really work, didn't really scale. And then it was what was called multi-agent systems. So having different systems that have different pieces of knowledge that all argued and tried to kind of create new knowledge. That didn't really scale. And then it was bigger brains, and then it was multi-agent systems again. And now it's big brains. It's large language models that now have billions of neurons. And what we're also now seeing is that those brains turning into agents. So agents have multiple different specialisms that are all able to collaborate and communicate. So AI has been cyclic, but I think that looking at AI through technologies like large language models is not useful. Operations research optimization is a perfectly valid set of technologies that are really good at decision making. Machine learning is really good at surfacing insights and explaining those insights from data. Large language models are really great for creating content. So I think it's always best to start with what's the application, and then what are the right algorithms to apply to that problem. But for me, the true definition of AI are systems that can safely adapt themselves in production.
And that's super interesting, because that's not how we think about human intelligence at all, really. I don't think, if on the other hand, it probably is a great definition of human intelligence. We're very good at, safely adapting, how we do things in production. Otherwise, we would have become extinct a long time ago. But what are some of the key differences between these concepts of artificial intelligence as we have them now and human intelligence, especially given that, as you said, when AI started being discussed, around the 50s, 60s, 70s, I think more of the thinking back then was more aligned with how do we create intelligences, artificial intelligences that think like humans, and we've moved away from that. So how's that evolved?
That's a really great question. So what tends to happen is that we tend to try to collapse lots of different sort of phenomena into a single definition. So one might argue that what's unique about humans is metacognition, our ability to plan over a long-term horizon, a very long-term horizon. We can plan, for next year and things like that. And what might be another definition, which is language. Or in fact, actually, humans are incredibly adaptive. We are, one of the most adaptive species. So I think that the problem is we take all of these different phenomena and we then try to come up with one single definition. I think what's interesting about this idea of intelligence, goal-directed adaptive behavior, and definitions of consciousness, which is a subject that I'm very interested in. And again, the definitions of consciousness also have this problem, is that there are these different types of phenomena, whether it be self-awareness, whether it be your ability to feel pain or emotion, again, metacognition, planning, that try to get collapsed into a single definition of consciousness. There's one of my advisory board members of my new company, Consium, is a professor called Carl Friston, and he's been developing and promoting an idea for many decades called the free energy principle. And I'm going to do a sort of a bastardized version, but this essentially is you have an expectation about the world, and if that expectation is met, then you don't need to necessarily be conscious or aware of it. If the expectation is not met, if you expect something and it's not met, then you need to sort of interrogate it so that next time your expectation is met. In some respects, consciousness is born out of our need to close the gap between what's expected and what actually happens. again, a tool to allow us to adapt more quickly to a changing world. So I think adaptation is synonymous with intelligence, and I think consciousness is a set of tools that allow us to be more adaptive. So, but I think we need to be careful not to try to come up with one single definition that explains lots of different phenomena. I think we'll continue to argue about definitions for the next 200 years.
And that's a really interesting point, and I think is actually something that is a common theme that we hear across a lot of different types of technology, not just artificial intelligence. Jannah and I have this debate when it comes to things like digital assets and cryptocurrencies all the time, which is that no one can agree on a definition, but actually what really kind of matters at the end of the day is the functionality and what is being done or what it's being used for. But I also found it really interesting, this point on adaptation as well. I'm not sure if you've read, there's a book by John Wyndham called Stowaway to Mars, which is quite dated now, but it basically is about a planet where the people who were on Mars adapted instead and evolved to create minds that were the next evolution of humans. And basically the whole idea purported by the book is that that is the next adaptation there. But I think, sci-fi aside, there have been a lot of really fascinating and adaptations and developments in the past few years. And Jannah and I have discussed before along the lines of the law of accelerating returns and why we've seen things now moving quicker and quicker. Could you talk to us about a few of those tech developments we've seen over the past decade, or even in the past 25 years that you've been in this space, and what you see as some of the more rapid advances that have been made, and also maybe where those are going?
Yeah, so I would still argue that companies get the biggest bang for their buck if they apply relatively basic automation, so replacing human beings that are making decisions with things that can make the decisions that we know are better than human beings, but also optimization. And optimization matured 3 decades ago, but I think we get excited about emerging technologies. So 10 years ago, we got excited about big data and putting Tableau or some sort of analytics layer on top and throwing loads of machine learning experts and hoping that by extracting insights from data and giving those insights to human beings, they will lead to better decisions. For the most part, giving human beings better insights doesn't typically lead to better decisions because we're not good at dealing with lots of different things. So, and now what's happening is that obviously the large language models are phenomenally powerful. But people are trying to then apply that technology to, again, solving the wrong problems. We get very excited about emerging technologies, but we then apply them in the wrong way. Then what happens is we blame the technologies. We say it's a bubble, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is it's people misunderstanding what are the appropriate algorithms, what are the appropriate techniques to solving those particular type of problems. And the example I always give is like a staff rostering problem, which is if I have 5 staff members and 5 jobs, there are 120 possible solutions, 5 factorial, 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. If I have 15 staff members and 15 jobs, there are now a trillion possible solutions. If I have 60 people and 60 jobs, there are more possible solutions than there are atoms in the universe. Now, the point here is that applying machine learning is not the right thing to do. Applying generative AI is not the right thing to do. You need to apply optimization algorithms. And so there are all of these problems that exist in industry where people tend to apply the wrong problems. And so I think, first of all, educating oneself about what the right technologies are key. That said, what's really special about large language models and really exciting is that at the moment they operate statistically. They take all of this data, language data, and they're able to very accurately predict what's going on within that data. So. And again, the example I always give that if you have in your data the ability to predict that Socrates is a man and the ability to predict that all men are mortal, at the moment, unfortunately, they can't predict that that Socrates is mortal. If you don't have that in your data. What's interesting about this next generation of large language models is the ability to reason. So they'll be able to take those concepts that Socrates is a man and that all men are mortal, and then be able to infer using logic and reasoning new data, new knowledge. And so I know there's a lot of concern at the moment about there's not enough data in the world to now feed these large language models. But once we get these large language models to be able to reason and create new data, then that's exciting. I also think that over the next 18 months, they'll graduate from what I argue now is an intoxicated graduate to a PhD level. So they'll be able to be given a complex problem, use the scientific method to break that problem down, run experiments to be able to validate whether the hypothesis is true or not. And again, that will allow us to create new knowledge. 18 months beyond that, we'll have a postdoc, and 18 months beyond that, we'll probably have a professor in our pocket. Now, those professors, or even those PhDs, are not going to be still good at solving that staff rostering problem. They're not going to have the capability to solve that optimization problem. But what they may have the capability is creating algorithms that solve that problem. So what I'm excited about over the next 5 years is the use of these technologies to create new knowledge, new algorithmic discoveries that can really move the needle in solving problems more effectively.
I think that there's a few points there that I'd like to pick up on, but one in particular is going back to the point you've made about there being not enough data, people saying there's not enough data in the world to continue training algorithms, and the next stage therefore being this ability for inference, the inference capability being the next big step. And obviously it's also, when we go back to my computer science undergrad days in the late 90s, when we'd touch on bits of AI, but it was generally accepted at the time that the data would never exist on a sufficient scale that you could actually train anything that was likely to be recognizable AI, or something that would pass the Turing test in any kind of convincing way. And that was solved through that combination of big data and also the advent of public cloud. So we had, the vast volumes of data being available, in an accessible manner. And so that kind of frontier, that very boring in a way, infrastructure capability led to the ability to then, actually train these algorithms and make the advances. But what you're describing there, that that progression from just being able to, the ability for a large language model to process a load of data and then basically create something that's very clever predictive text, versus that next step of inference. And that's actually quite a significant stepping stone, step change in capability. And it's arguably a different paradigm altogether, right? So what's happening in our understanding of how these algorithms work that's enabling those kind of step changes to take place?
I don't know the kind of the sort of inner details, but there's a sort of statistical process which is based on my data. Can I confidently, with some high degree of probability, know that Socrates is a man and know that all men are mortal? And then you need a different sort of method. So, Daniel Kahneman might argue this is system 1 and system 2 thinking, where you have a probabilistic sort of mechanism versus a sort of logical reasoning mechanism. The way that I guess understand these systems being glued together, which again in AI terms are called subsymbolic AI. So subsymbolic AI are neural networks, and then symbolic AI are then being able to reason with concepts and knowledge. Knowledge graphs are likely to be a mechanism to allow us to do inference. So if I use my statistical brain to know things about the world, I can then capture that into a knowledge graph, and then I can use what is called semantic inference to create new knowledge. That can then go back into the statistical model. Again, it's not really how our brains work, and one might actually argue that humans are not really very good at reasoning. We can reason with a few things, but we can't reason with thousands of things. But there is going to be an interesting step change in the capability of these technologies over the next 3, 4, 5 years, as they get better at combining these statistical methods with more logic, reasoning type methods. Getting them to do science is an interesting step, and getting them to do general science again is even more interesting, and that may or may not happen very, very quickly. Now, there's maybe one thing that might be interesting for people, though, is that there's obviously a lot of scrutiny around the amount of data and the energy required to train large language models. And whilst large language models are called neural networks, and that's what we have in our brains are neural networks, they're actually very crude representations of how our brains work. And there is an emerging set of technologies that I've been tracking for the past few decades, since my PhD actually, in modeling bumblebee brains, called spiking neural networks, or more generally what are called neuromorphic technologies. Now, these spiking neural networks are modeled much more on how our biological brains process information, which is not propagating numbers through the whole network, but spikes, and those spikes have different frequencies and different patterns, and they come and sort of interact in different time windows. But that complexity allows much more capability. And so the idea of, if we can get spiking neural networks working more effectively, it will massively reduce the amount of power needed to train them and run them, massively reduce the amount of data, and also they'd be highly adaptive. You only have to be told that that's a cup before you know what cups are. Large language models have to be told things are a cup many, many, many times. And what I think is going to happen is, I think there's going to be a breakthrough of these new spiking or neuromorphic technologies, and those neuromorphic technologies will be embedded in agents. Now, those agents might be digital agents that operate on our machines, but they also might be agents that operate in the physical world, so like your robots, your hoovers, your cars. And what's interesting there is, I think that these technologies will spawn the robot revolution, which will then also spawn potentially questions around consciousness and self-awareness. And I think this is a very exciting decade to be alive because of that.
And
which leads me on to another question, picking up on something you said earlier. Well, a few things, really. You talked about the different types of intelligence, and about, how we need to move away from a single general construct to multiple different types of intelligence. Maybe we solve for them in different ways or combine them in different ways. And I think that's really important as well when we think about, again, going back to the sci-fi side, what alien intelligence might look like, or what non-human intelligence on Earth might look like, that it might not be what we might recognize in ourselves. But you also spoke about, the excited undergrad level of AIs at the moment, to going up to a more sophisticated PhD, and eventually the learned professor. And once we get to the learned professor level, that's when potentially that learned professor level AI is going to be writing its own code and writing its own programs to solve problems for us, which leads to the question of explainability. Obviously, there's a huge amount of risk in getting to a point where an AI is able to create solutions which might be very elegantly coded, but be almost, incomprehensible to the human brain as to how they work. How do we ensure that explainability and that ability for humans to understand what is actually happening at each step of the way, and support and question and ultimately have control and governance over these AI generated solutions takes place?
Well, I mean, this might be a bit cynical, but I think every technology that we've created, we've regulated that has a material impact on people's lives, whether it be automation or automotive or pharmaceuticals or aerospace. And unfortunately, it's not until things go wrong do we then start to bring in regulation. And when I build AI systems, there are broadly three questions I ask myself. One is the intent appropriate? And really, this is a question of ethics. And I know there's lots of people that have rebranded themselves as AI ethicists, but I would controversially argue there's no such thing as AI ethics. So the difference at the moment between human beings and AIs is that AIs don't have intent. Human beings have intent, and we use AI as a tool to achieve that intent. And it's the intent that needs to get scrutinized from an ethics perspective. That said, I do think there are AI ethics questions we can talk about later on if you want. But the second question is explainability. I guess the only difference between software and AI typically is that AI is opaque in terms of how it's making its decisions. And I think, unfortunately, what will happen is that we're going to be using AI to make decisions, and it won't be until those decisions cause harm will we start to see more regulation. And then the third question, and this is related to the second one, is not what happens if my AI goes wrong. As engineers, we try to identify failure points and we try to mitigate those failure points. But we now have to ask ourselves what happens if the AI goes very right, and what harm can that cause? Now, I can give you lots of examples where we've built AI systems where it would have massively overachieved the goal that we gave it, but it would have caused harm elsewhere in the supply chain. And that's it's sort of okay to make some of those mistakes. But if we are creating machines that have the ability to materially impact everybody's lives. We need to get it right now, which is one of the reasons why I'm personally leaning into the questions of AI safety.
So, and just to maybe unpack that a little bit further then, because I feel like you mentioned a few different things there with regards to explainability and the types of and harm, but you also mentioned obviously the robot revolution, and there's a lot of things as well that are talked about in pop culture. Different AI models are being pitted against each other, and the things that are behind them or the data models that they're built on, and all of these things are raised as risks. But could you talk a little bit more about some of the specific real risks and real harms that you're worried about, as well as challenges that are being posed, and maybe debunk some of those popular perceptions that we see too, because I'm sure not every ending is going to be like iRobot necessarily.
Yeah, well, I can give you a few examples. One, actually going back to the staff rostering example, which I like, because we built incredibly powerful staff rostering solutions, and this we worked with one of the biggest audit companies in the world. They had 5,000 people they need to allocate to jobs, and the goal for this project was, if we can build an AI that can allocate people, like say 2% better than human beings, so 2% more utilization, so unlock 2% more billable hours, the project would be an overwhelming success. Now, we built an algorithm that was able to achieve 12% utilization. Now, of course, the business perspective is they were rubbing their hands together. This is unlocking hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit. But what would have happened is that those plans would have meant that people would have been driving longer distances to clients, so it would have had a negative impact on the environment. Clients wouldn't have the continuity that they wanted, so clients would be unhappy. Employees wouldn't be having time to train, so that they would be unhappy. So by overachieving one goal, it actually causes harm elsewhere. Now, I'm in the marketing world now, and you can imagine if we let AI loose to optimize marketing, there's a human bias called homophily, which is we tend to like to engage with people that look and sound like us. We tend to trust people that look and sound like us. And so if we let AI loose to optimize ads, you might end up with a world where you have you selling to you. Now, that might be very good for business, but it might be enforcing social biases and bigotry and bubbles. So we need to think about the consequences of what happens if we overachieve that goal. In pretty much every project that we do, we think carefully about what harm can it cause across the supply chain. Now, I would argue those are micro problems. Those are problems that where we're deploying AI every day on a practical basis. I would also argue there's a set of risks called malicious risks, which are preventing bad actors from creating pathogens and misinformation. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the role of the government. But from a macro perspective, I argue there are 6 macro risks associated with AI that I've used the PESTLE framework. I don't know if you're familiar with PEST, but PESTLE, it stands for political, environmental, social, technological, legal, and economic. So it's essentially a macro framework to think about things. And I actually argue there's a pestle of singularities. There's a pestle of things that we are facing as a species that are being accelerated by AI, that we're facing into over the next decade that we need to solve for. I'm happy to go into the details if you want to.
Yeah. Please do.
Well, just very quickly, I would argue the political singularity, and if people don't know what the singularity is, then it comes from physics. It's referred to as a point in time and space we can't see beyond, and it was adopted by the AI community to refer to the technological singularity, which is the point in time where we build a machine 1,000,000 times smarter than us. So I argue there's a pestle of singularities. So the political singularity, I argue, is a post-truth world, a world where people no longer know what is true. Now, misinformation bots, deepfakes have challenged our political foundations, and they continue to challenge our political foundations, but they're also now challenging the fabric of our reality. With a few seconds of somebody's voice and a few images, we can clone them. And I worry about a world where we completely lose trust in all of the content that we're engaging with. And I actually think we can solve that problem, but it requires regulation to mitigate the risk of a post-truth world. The environmental singularities, I think, we're all familiar with this. This is the point in time where we lose control over our ecosystem or gain control over our ecosystem. And I would argue that actually, if we apply AI in the right way across our organizations, we could easily reduce the amount of energy by half. So whenever I've done a project with a company, we typically reduce the amount of carbon by about 25% and unlock more capability. So if we apply algorithms in the right way, we could run this planet and unlock more capability without losing control of our ecosystem. The social singularity, I would argue, is a world where we cure death. So there are scientists that believe there are people alive today that don't have to die. AI is advancing medicine rapidly. It's able to monitor
I just
ourselves.
Watched the documentary on Don't Die last
Don't
night.
Die,
so
yeah.
just carry on.
I'm a big fan of Brian Johnson. I buy all of his stuff.
We need a whole separate podcast episode on this. I'm so fascinated by this topic as well.
I've got my red hat therapy as well. Anyway, I've got there are scientists that believe there are people alive today that don't have to die, and I don't know what the world looks like when we realize there are people amongst us that won't have to die. The technological singularity we've already talked about, which is when we build a brain a million times smarter than us. And one of the reasons why I've started Conscium, the consciousness company, is that I believe that having aligned conscious AIs are going to be safer than zombie large language models. That's probably a different podcast in itself. The legal singularity is when surveillance becomes ubiquitous. And I guess what I mean by that is that AI is very good at understanding people, and it's now becoming very good at being able to influence people. And we want to mitigate and make sure that those technologies are not being used to accumulate more wealth and more power with a handful of bad actors. And the final singularity actually is my favorite singularity. It's called the economic singularity. It was coined by a very good friend of mine called Callum Chase. And this is the impact of AI on jobs. And, I've been building AI solutions for the past 17 years. And I think that, AI has not replaced people. It's freed people from mundane tasks. And I think over the next 10 years, we're going to see a Cambrian explosion of new innovations, new opportunities for people to contribute. I think beyond 10 years, nobody knows what they're talking about. And if I was to give you the kind of two extremes that we hear in the press, the one extreme is that if we can free up whole jobs, we probably will. And if that happens very quickly, we create lots of unemployment, our economies can't rebalance, and it creates social unrest. And I actually think that we need to lean into figuring out how to solve that problem. The alternative view is we should be automating as much and as fast as possible by removing the friction from the creation and dissemination of goods like food, healthcare, energy, education, transport. We can bring the cost of goods down to zero. So it's often referred to as a world of abundance or a Star Trek economy. But if you were born into a world where you don't have access to paid work, but have access to everything that you need to survive and thrive as a human being, I actually think that's an amazing world. So, people say to me, Daniel, what would I do if I didn't have a job? A job defines who I am as a human being. Now, I know lots of people who don't have jobs, but they're not sitting at home bored and depressed. They're usually using their time to try and contribute to humanity. And I ask people this all the time. What would you do if you didn't have to do paid work, but everything was free, everything was abundant? And people say they'll play golf and indulge in their hobbies and travel and spend time with their friends and family. But if you keep pushing people hard enough, they say the same thing, which is, I want to do something that makes the world a little bit better. And I think that we all have an innate desire to do all of those things that satisfy our selfish needs, but also want to contribute somehow to humanity. And I think that if we got the timing right, we could use AI to help liberate people to actually live their true humanity.
I think that's super interesting because also, most people don't want to be wage slaves. Most, the point of a human life is not necessarily to just go and work for someone else. And so there's a huge question there about the value you can contribute towards society versus what you have to do within society in order to survive, and that whole world of post-scarcity capitalism and what that might look like. But that is another podcast for another time. With those various singularities, you've mentioned some that could be heading towards a very dystopian future, and others that could be heading towards a really positive future for humanity and for the earth. How do we collectively influence and steer that towards the positive outcome rather than, Skynet?
I think you're absolutely right. And the whole point of a singularity is we can't see beyond it. But like any amazing technology, AI is a tool, and it's up to us to figure out how to use that tool in a way that is positive. So I actually think it's education. it's podcasts like this, it's educating as many decision makers as possible to understand what these technologies can do and can't do, so they're not scared of them, and also to make sure that they're holding themselves to account, that we're holding them to account, to make sure that we're using these technologies in the right way.
So, and would it be fair to say, because you also said, in some ways beyond 10 years, nobody knows too much what they're talking about. But if we do think into this kind of far, far future of humanity, if you had to, choose, would you say then that we are heading towards that positive path where we can get to a place of abundance, where we can use AI for good, where we can not die and use it for all of these many different means? Or do you think that, we're going a different way? Or is it all down to that regulation and education?
I think it's a really great question. I think that if we just took on face value what we see in the news and social media, we would all think we're doomed. But the fact is that there are economic indicators to suggest more and more people are being elevated from poverty. More and more people are becoming economically free, and they're not abusing that freedom. They're using their time, using their assets to try and contribute to humanity. And there's a concept. It's not called a utopia. I don't think we'd agree on what a utopia is, but there's a concept called a protopia, which is a system that is essentially getting better over time. And I think the more people we free from economic constraints, the more we give them the ability to educate themselves, to help them understand what it means to make them happy, to give them the tools to be able to innovate. I think they will use those tools to create new things that, again, free people up and enable them to live their humanity. And I think that is the world that we're moving towards.
Fantastic. I mean, I think that's a great place to end on, and indeed a very positive note, certainly more positive than what we see in the headlines. So I just want to thank you so much again for coming on The Outside Context. It's been a great conversation, and really looking forward to seeing the output of all of your research and various projects in the future.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.